Welcome, everyone. Whether you are currently prepping for a big meeting or doing some chores around the house, or you are just intensely curious about how mass communication shapes the world, you are in exactly the right place.
You really are. It is great to be here.
Today, we are taking a deep dive into a massive stack of source material surrounding an event of truly staggering scale.
Yeah, staggering is definitely the right word for it.
And it took place just yesterday, Friday, February 27th, 2026.
The recency of this material is great. But honestly, the sheer volume of the audience is what really stands out to me.
Right.
We're talking about tens of thousands of people gathered in a single physical location.
With thousands more plugged in digitally across the globe.
Exactly. It is a massive undertaking.
It is.
Okay.
And the sources we are looking at include a highly detailed sermon outline paired with a full video transcript.
Titled Multiple Miracles at the Turning Point.
Right. Delivered by Pastor Dr. W.F. Kumuyi at the Global Crusade with Kumuyi.
For GCK.
Yes. GCK in Port Harcourt, Nigeria. Now, a quick heads up for you listening. We have some deeply religious, intensely passionate source material today.
Very passionate.
But our goal here is not to endorse or validate the theological viewpoints or the miraculous claims contained in the text.
Wait, we are not debating theology today.
Yeah, exactly. We simply want to impartially explore the ideas, the themes, and the rhetorical structures presented in the original source material.
We are putting on our communication hats, basically.
Precisely. We are looking at this purely through the lens of communication, persuasion, and human experience. How do you speak to a sea of humanity at an open field and systematically move them to action?
It is the perfect lens for this deep dive, I think, because understanding how large-scale messages are constructed and delivered helps us understand what actually resonates with massive audiences.
Right.
Whether you approach this from a religious background or a secular or entirely academic one, decoding how these messages are architected reveals so much about human psychology.
It really does.
When a speaker can capture and direct the attention of a crowd that size, it ceases to be just a speech. It becomes a highly calibrated psychological event.
Okay, let's unpack this because the foundational theme of the entire message doesn't actually start with a grand miracle.
No, it doesn't.
It starts with a very specific, demanding concept drawn from the text of Joel chapter 2, verse 12.
The concept of the turning point.
Yes, the turning point. The source material defines this not just as a change of mind, but as the exact moment you turn away from everything else you have ever known or relied upon.
Including yourself.
Exactly, turning away from yourself.
That framing is essential for what follows. It establishes a baseline of total surrender for the audience.
Right before you can receive anything, you have to empty your hands of what you are currently holding.
But the speaker does something really brilliant here to ensure this abstract theological concept sticks in the minds of the crowd.
He uses a mnemonic device, right?
He does. He packages a complex critique of religious hypocrisy into a highly memorable acronym. He warns the audience against relying solely on their own personal works rather than divine grace.
Framing it as EGO.
Yes, EGO, which stands for Edging God Out.
Edging God out. I mean, calling it EGO is a fascinating rhetorical choice.
It really is clever.
It takes an ancient spiritual critique and translates it into almost a three-letter corporate buzzword that the audience can instantly visualize and take home with them.
And the source material uses this EGO concept to heavily critique religious traditionalists.
Specifically referencing the Pharisees.
Right. And for anyone listening who might not be steeped in biblical history, the Pharisees were essentially the ultimate metric-driven religious folks of the ancient world.
They loved their KPIs of faith.
They absolutely did. They prided themselves on following the rules perfectly. They were the religious elite who believed their strict adherence to the law earned them divine favor.
The speaker points out how they would publicly brag about fasting twice a week.
Treating God almost like a transactional vending machine.
I do this, so you owe me that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the text notes that Jesus said those men went home condemned. The speaker is delivering a massive critique of people who think they can force divine intervention through the sheer willpower of rigid rule following.
Which makes sense for establishing that baseline of surrender, but does attacking the rule followers first risk alienating the religious traditionalists in the crowd who actually pride themselves on their discipline?
It is a calculated risk, but a necessary one structurally.
How so?
By dismantling the professional religious attendees, he levels the playing field for the rest of the crowd. He is establishing that sincerity matters way more than a resume of good works.
Ah, I see. And the source material emphasizes this three-way response required by God: fasting, weeping, and mourning.
But it explicitly states that God completely rejects these actions if they are just theatrical performances.
Right, hypocrisy creates a literal wall. And the speaker illustrates this theater of religion with a very vivid, almost cinematic anecdote.
It is a great story.
He asks the crowd to imagine a group of people walking to a house of mourning to visit a bereaved family. And all along the road, the text describes these people joking, laughing, and bantering.
Having great time.
Right, but the absolute second they reach the front door, a switch flips.
They instantly burst into loud, profuse, performative weeping.
Exactly. The family inside thinks it is genuine grief, but it is an entirely manufactured performance.
It perfectly highlights the absurdity of going through the motions. When you read the transcript of that moment, he isn't just delivering a dry theology lesson.
He is pointing out a recognizable, deeply human social dynamic.
Very human.
And he connects that fake weeping directly to a reference in Malachi chapter 2, verse 13, where people insincerely cover the altar of the Lord with tears.
He warns the audience that you can quote all the scripture you want, but if you are laughing on the way to the altar and faking tears when you arrive, the offer is rejected.
It demands a totally stripped-down, authentic vulnerability.
What's fascinating here is how that demand for total vulnerability transitions into the core structural promise of the sermon.
Right, the three miracle.
Yes. Once the audience is mentally stripped of their ego, the message builds on three predicted miracles. But before we look at the miracles themselves, we have to examine the linguistic anchor the speaker uses.
He repeatedly directs the audience's attention to a specific phrase.
It shall come to pass.
He hammers that phrase relentlessly throughout the transcript.
Because it is an assertion of absolute linguistic certainty.
Right.
We live in an incredibly uncertain world, saturated with hedge words. People constantly say hopefully, or we anticipate, or subject to change.
Always leaving it out.
Exactly. But the speaker cuts through that modern anxiety by telling the audience that whenever they read it shall come to pass, it means absolute undeniable assurance.
Not a maybe.
Not a maybe. He is effectively commanding the crowd to suspend their skepticism because the promises being made on that field are guaranteed.
Which really sets the stage for the first of those three pillars, the promised miracle of assured salvation.
And the language shifts here to become radically inclusive.
Drawing from Joel 2, verse 32 and Acts 2, verse 21, the text constantly circles back to the word whosoever.
Whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord.
The speaker tells the crowd that this salvation does not depend on their emotional state, and it definitely does not depend on how hard they try.
It is purely based on faith.
It is the ultimate democratization of the message. Having just dismantled the gatekeeping of the Pharisees, he opens the gates entirely.
And he goes out of his way to emphasize that hidden dirt or defilement doesn't matter.
Right. The text says that even if a person harbors an evil, that society cannot see God sees it, and crucially, that person will still not be cast away.
For an audience potentially carrying immense personal guilt or societal shame, providing a total reset button with zero prerequisite works is an incredibly powerful psychological hook.
It creates a tremendous sense of relief.
It really does. And once that foundation of unconditional assured salvation is laid, the speaker expertly pivots to the second pillar.
The predicted miracle of abundant supply.
This is where the rhetorical strategy bridges ancient texts and highly immediate modern anxieties.
The text references Joel chapter 2, verses 21 through 26, bringing up the imagery of the pastures of the wilderness due spring.
And the promise of restoring the years eaten by the locust, the cankerworm, and the caterpillar.
Now, for a modern listener, a cankerworm or a locust might just sound like an agricultural nuisance.
Like just some bugs.
But in the ancient agrarian context of this text, these aren't just bugs. They represent total, uncontrollable devastation.
A literal force majeure.
Exactly. A force that strips away your entire livelihood and food supply overnight. The speaker is taking an ancient nightmare of famine and mapping it directly onto modern financial and physical ruin.
He contrasts this abundant supply directly with John chapter 10, verse 10, pointing out that the thief comes only to steal, to kill, and to destroy.
But he doesn't leave the thief as an abstract theological concept.
No, he applies it to the visceral realities of his audience. He claims this enemy steals health, joy, and comfort.
He talks about the literal killing of cells in the body, making nerves go numb, and the sudden destruction of a booming business.
And here's a detail that completely stood out to me. When discussing the thief stealing health, he gets startlingly specific about age and cognitive decline.
Yes, the text mentions the loss of brain power, specifically calling out the age of 57.
He mimics someone going to a medical authority complaining about memory loss, and the authority brushing it off as just the mark of old age at 57.
But the speaker rejects that diagnosis, promising that the brain will not die and that cognitive function will be restored.
This is where we see a masterclass insight into breaking what psychologists call the bystander effect in mass crowds.
The bystander effect. Explain that a bit for the listener.
Sure. When you're in a crowd of tens of thousands, it is easy to feel invisible, to feel like the speaker is addressing a broad, faceless mass.
You're just one person in a sea of people.
Exactly. But when a speaker gets hyper-specific, calling out an exact age like 57 or a specific fear like early onset memory loss, it pierces that invisibility.
The people who are 57 feel seen.
And for everyone else, the subconscious assumption is, if he understands the exact nuanced fears of that person over there, his broader promises of abundant supply must also be true for me.
That is a brilliant tactic, and he does it again with social anxieties.
Oh, the in-laws comment.
Yes. The text promises to clear away the reproach of barrenness. It explicitly notes that attendees will eat in plenty, be satisfied, and no longer feel ashamed before their peers or their in-laws.
That isn't just about food, that is about cultural standing.
Dealing with the judgment of your in-laws is a deeply resonant, highly personal pain point to address over loudspeakers to a massive crowd.
It perfectly connects the macro theology to the micro reality of the listener's family dinners and social standing. It makes a broadcast message feel custom tailored.
So we have the assured salvation, we have the abundant supply. That leads us into the third pillar, the present miracle of the anointing spirit.
This is anchored in Joel chapter 2, verse 28's promise that God will pour out his spirit on all flesh.
From the old men dreaming dreams to the young men seeing visions.
And here the speaker deploys a brilliant somatic anchoring technique.
He literally tells the audience to look at their own body, right?
Yes, he tells them to pull the flesh on their own arm. He asks, do you have flesh? Pull the flesh by your arm. Is there something to pull there?
It is a physical interactive tactic that forces the audience out of their heads.
In psychology, somatic touch grounds you in the present reality. By having them physically pinch their own skin, he turns an abstract spiritual outpouring into a tangible, undeniable physical qualification.
If you have flesh to pinch, you qualify.
Exactly. We connect this to the bigger picture. It sets up the beautiful progression of imagery that follows.
The speaker introduces the metaphor of Ezekiel's river.
Now, for those unfamiliar, this is a visionary river in the Old Testament that gets progressively deeper.
The speaker describes wading into this water. First, it's at the ankles, which he compares to basic salvation.
But the urging is to move deeper, to the knees, then the waist, until it becomes a river you have to surrender your footing to and actively swim in.
It's a metaphor for progressively letting go of your own control and trusting the current.
Not limiting the spirit in their lives.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. To prove that this river of the spirit can actually change reality, the sermon reaches its narrative climax.
The speaker shares a highly personal anecdote about running into a former secondary school classmate.
This classmate had a terrifying recurring swelling on the back of her hand. The text refers to it as a hunchback swelling.
It is a highly strategic choice of anecdote. He doesn't choose a vague internal pain. He chooses a highly visible, deeply disfiguring, and persistent physical ailment.
A completely undeniable problem.
Right.
The text claims this woman had gone to the hospital for 2 separate surgeries to have this mass cut off, and both times it aggressively grew back.
And the tension builds because the speaker reveals that at the time he was experiencing the exact same swelling on his own hand.
But the turning point in the story comes during a previous prayer meeting. After being instructed by a pastor to simply lay a hand on the problem area, the speaker claims his swelling completely vanished.
No hospital visit, no failed surgeries.
It disappeared without a trace and never returned.
Delivering this story right before the climax of the event provides the audience with supposed concrete, localized proof of the miracles being promised.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most structurally fascinating element of this entire deep dive.
A structural pivot.
Yes, the sermon ends, the emotional peak is reached, the altar call is made.
This raises an important question for you, the listener. When you have thousands of people experiencing a profound emotional and spiritual peak, all at the exact same moment, how does an organization practically capture and retain that kinetic energy?
It is an incredible pivot. You go from the transcendent spiritual imagery of swimming in Ezekiel's river directly into an intensely corporate, highly rigorous logistical operation.
The second the spiritual appeal concludes, The text shifts into pure administrative mobilization.
It is a massive CRM, customer relationship management operation happening in an open field.
Counselors are deployed instantly. They aren't just praying with people, they are distributing slips of paper to harvest data.
Names, addresses, and phone numbers.
And they account for infrastructure gaps in real time.
Yes. This part was amazing. The speaker explicitly instructs the crowd to give the exact name they are known by locally.
And if a person lives on a street that lacks official house numbers, they are told to provide the popular, well-known name of their compound so they can be physically located later.
They are essentially establishing GPS coordinates for follow-up.
The contrast is striking. A message entirely about unearned divine grace seamlessly transitions into demanding precise data harvesting.
And it does not stop at the physical boundaries of the field in Port Harcourt.
No, the transcript reveals a massive, synchronized digital integration strategy.
He addresses the broadcast audience directly. For the internet viewers, he broadcast a URL gckhq.org/connect, instructing them to click the link right below their video player.
And for those listening on the radio or watching on traditional television, he gives out a dedicated WhatsApp number live from the stage.
The transcript has him reading it out twice for accuracy. +2349154444926
They are capturing leads across every conceivable medium simultaneously.
But data is useless without a retention strategy.
And that is where the sheer speed of their follow-up is astounding. They do not let the emotion of Friday night fade into the weekend.
The text announces a lunch hour with Jesus Believers Banquet scheduled for 3 p.m. the very next day.
Less than 24 hours later.
Less than 24 hours.
They tell the physical crowd exactly where to go. The White House and the compound by the left entrance.
And for the digital converts, there is a specialized online banquet taking place on Sunday, March 1st, broadcast from their headquarters.
They transition a person from an emotional turning point into a scheduled physical community integration almost instantly.
So what does this all mean? We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started with the foundational demand of the turning point, exploring the danger of ego-edging God out through performative religious metrics.
We analyze the absolute linguistic certainty of it shall come to pass, and how the promise of assured salvation removes all barriers to entry.
We looked at how ancient agrarian nightmares, like the cankerworm, are mapped onto modern anxieties, and how hyper-specific targeting, like age 57 brain power, shatters the bystander effect.
We waded into the metaphor of Ezekiel's river anchored by the somatic pinch of the arm and the visceral story of the hunchback hand.
And finally, we witnessed the striking transition from spiritual transcendence into a meticulously organized, tech-enabled data harvesting and retention operation.
It truly is a profound study in event architecture. And I want to circle back to our premise at the start of the show.
Right.
We maintain our strict impartiality regarding the theology itself, but objectively observing the structure of this text provides a masterclass in mass communication.
It shows us how a skilled orator can blend ancient scripture with deeply relatable modern pain points and cap it off with a precise, inescapable call to action.
It is a finely tuned engine of human mobilization.
It absolutely is. And as we wrap up today's deep dive, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Building on the source material, but looking at it from a new angle.
Exactly. Let's return to that clever acronym the speaker used at the very beginning. EGO, edging God out.
The text used it to critique ancient Pharisees who relied too heavily on their own fasting and rule following.
But I want you to think about that concept from a purely secular, modern psychological perspective for a moment.
If we look at our broader culture today, we live in an era absolutely obsessed with the hustle.
The glorification of the self-made individual.
We are constantly pressured to optimize our routines, track our habits, and curate the perfect LinkedIn profile. We are the ultimate metric-driven society.
We are the modern Pharisees of productivity.
We really are.
So could it be that our intense, almost religious focus on our own works, our own hustle, is actually the very thing creating a wall between us and true fulfillment?
Whether you frame it as edging God out, or simply edging out your community, your peace of mind, and simple grace.
Could learning to surrender control rather than constantly grasping for it be the real turning point we need in our hyper-individualized world?
It is a powerful question. Sometimes the most radical transformative thing you can do is simply let go of the wheel.
Beautifully said. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive and for exploring the fascinating architecture of mass persuasion with us.
It was a great discussion.
Remember to keep questioning, keep analyzing the messages around you, and we will catch you next time. Take care, everyone.